Welcome to Austen Mondays. I am your host, Edward G. Pettit from the Rosenbach Museum and Library in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. And for 24 weeks, we're going on a biblio venture with Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice. In each episode, I talk with a special guest, a brilliant Austen scholar, creator, or Janeite about Austen and her works. And then I have an hour-long conversational annotation with a chapter co-host in which we illuminate, elucidate, and explicate a few chapters of Pride and Prejudice. And our brilliant special guest for today's episode is Dr. Emily C. Friedman. Emily, welcome.
Hello, so happy to be here.
Great. I'm so happy we brought you into this fold of Janeite. So this will be a great conversation tonight we'll get to have.
Yeah, next best thing to being back in Philly. I am, of course, calling in from Auburn, Alabama.
All righty, but we're at one time here, right? In college?
Yes, proud Bryn Mawr grad, class of 2003, Green Lantern.
All righty. Okay, more with Emily in a moment, everyone. Stay tuned for also our chapter annotation segment when Dr. Kathleen Hudson will be joining me to talk about chapters 15 to 17, introducing Mr. Wickham. All right, we got Wickham in the fold finally. If you're watching live on YouTube or just watching the recording, I invite you to please like the video and also subscribe to the channel. Doing that gives our show greater visibility and leads to more people discovering Austen Mondays. So let's get on with the show. For today's A Turnabout the Room, please welcome Dr. Emily C. Friedman, Associate Professor of English at Auburn University, where she teaches and writes on connections between the 18th century and today's new media phenomena. She also serves as the director of 18thconnect.org and the Manuscript Fiction Project, and with Emily M. N. Kugler is the project lead on Playing the 18th Century, which explores representations of 18th century culture in modern board, video, and role-playing games, all things that I enjoy myself. Welcome, Emily.
So excited for us to get to talk.
Good. All righty. Let's start off like we start our other guests. And in that, I like to ask people, do you have an Austen or Pride and Prejudice in particular discovery moment in your life? When did Austen become Austen for you?
It's such a great question, and I've had hours, folks, to think about this. And the first thing I'll say is I don't remember a time in my life without Jane Austen.
Wow.
But considering where we are, so to speak, I will share the moment I realized that I was associated with Austen in the minds of other people. And that was my first year at Bryn Mawr. Bryn Mawr used to have kind of joke trials where you were tried for crimes you committed, and I was tried for loving the 1995 Pride and Prejudice too much because I owned the VHS.
Wow.
And so had to dress as Elizabeth Bennet and go to class that day in the snow in February in full rig while carrying the box set with me. So on very short notice, and I think they got my mother to help. They jerry-rigged a Regency outfit that I have vastly improved upon in this decade since.
Wow, that's wonderful. I wish I had thought it happened to me. And I was looking for I have the VHS box that I have somewhere in the storage, and I couldn't find it. I was trying to drag it out for next week when we talk, because that's what we talked about last week. Instead of chapters, we did the whole 95 Pride and Prejudice. How was that? Do you remember then first watching that?
Well, it wouldn't have been when the BBC kind of live aired it, but not long after. And I really think, honestly, I come to you as a professional Austen scholar kind of by accident. Throughout the story of me and Jane Austen, it's other people kind of bringing me to Austen, kicking and screaming a lot of the time. So my friends in high school were really big fans of the mini series. I graduated in 1999 at the turn of the millennium. And so it was kind of by osmosis from their enthusiasm that I got originally hooked in. As an undergrad, I was fascinated by the world of the larger 18th century, the
Mhm.
writers that Austen was reading and thinking about. For me, Austen was um a way to and it's she still kind of is a way to kind of bring people in to the story of Mariah Edgeworth and Frances Burney, my girl Frances Burney, and Samuel Richardson, and so
Mhm.
many other writers that Austen was in conversation with and herself a fan of. So yeah, that's been the kind of story for me is Austen comes with a group of people who for her were living and dead, and for me are all dead.
This is what we one of the things they talked about with Jocelyn Harris and about the authors that Austen read and how she took from them. I think she said whatever she wanted and
Yes.
and then worked with it. And is that part of the work? But also part of the work you do is rediscovering people, right?
Yes, absolutely. And I will just say Jocelyn Harris is one of my heroines. Thanks to her, we have an edition of Sir Charles Grandison. I'm following in her footsteps, trying to make a new digital edition of Jane Austen's favorite novel. In that way, that's one of the many hats that I wear. But yeah, and so part of what I'm doing is also looking around for people who, like Austen, circulated their work partly in print for a commercial audience, but also preserved and circulated things among their friends and family, and who found pleasure and importance in that kind of move as well. I was just talking to my students in my graduate seminar on Austen this past week about the ways in which Austen looks very different when you look at her unpublished work.
Mhm.
And I find examples in collections all over the place. If you're local to Philly, you can also visit, for example, the Kislak Center, which has some beautiful manuscripts from the period that are very explicitly designed for one person and one person alone.
Mhm.
So I love the stories that are in those pages, as well as the stories that those physical objects represent. Just like Austen's manuscripts tell stories beyond just what's contained within them.
It's just I think we frequently think the manuscript culture kind of ends when printing really takes off, but it hasn't, and it certainly did in Austen's time. But even now, I would think that even just sharing, text on the internet without traditional publishing is a kind of manuscript culture still alive, isn't it?
Absolutely. So, one of the two book projects that I'm working on, because I make weird choices in life, is called Before Fan Fiction, and it's trying to connect the kind of manuscript world that Austen and people of her age and into the 19th century were participating in, very explicitly separated from print culture, how that anticipates and how we can understand those really well if we look to fan fiction, if we look to other kinds of forms where people are sharing among trusted groups, beyond the mainstream, who are not thinking about, is this going to sell, but instead are trying to create pleasurable experiences for the people that they care about.
How did this work with Austen in her life?
So what's fascinating to me, come back to Grandison, it's always going to come back to Grandison, is when I was at Shotton House Library as a fellow the first time, in 2009, I was working on my dissertation, finishing up on endings and ending expectations, but I was curious and pulled all of the manuscripts. And at the time, it was a small collection, so they didn't have very many, but they had the Austen theatrical manuscript, her adaptation for performance of Sir Charles Grandison. And in fact, it still has the straight pins. It's one of the few manuscripts that is as Austen left it.
Mhm.
She made packets and put straight pins to bind them. So I almost bled on it. I did not. Can't catch my DNA on that, but it's a very near thing. And so
And tell
I
people why did, I mean, she didn't adapt this for professional use. She wasn't trying to
No, it
advertise
was
for
it
it.
was a family favorite, and depending on who you ask, it was a family endeavor of adaptation. But it was for home performance to kind of experience the highlights of what is quite honestly one of the longest novels in
Mhm.
English. A great breakup novel, I will also just say, in interesting ways. And there's a book called Grandison's Heirs that argues that people like Austen basically pick this perfect man hero, Sir Charles, out of the novel and improve him and make him more true to life in
Mhm.
different kinds of ways. Some people have argued that George Knightley is basically built along the lines of Sir Charles Grandison, for example.
That's it. We have all of Richardson's works at the Rosenbach too in first edition. We have the Grandison is a 10 volumes. I can't remember how many volumes it is.
It's a chunky boy. It's a chunky
We
boy.
also have what I discovered, and I did not know. We have a Pamela there, and I knew we had a Pamela, but then when I looked at it a few weeks ago, it happens to be a Pamela in French. But what is more important about it, it's in 2 volumes. What's more important about it is Richardson signed it. He signed the front. So it has Richardson's signature in a French edition of Pamela, which I completely thought was, I
I
think.
don't want to offer it as too much, but I would be very curious to know if the Rosenbach has the Franklin piracy of Pamela, which is the first novel published in the United States.
I will look, but I don't think we do. So I think I would know it. Like I think that would have come across.
Ben Franklin was a notorious pirate, just so we know.
How about that? That's fabulous. All righty. Okay. So what I promise people, and what really fascinates me too about your work right now, is, well, as I'm only just getting to know you, it sounds like there's so much that we can talk
I'm
about.
a magpie. What can I say?
Is about this, how you explore, modern board, video, and role-playing games with 18th century literature and, well, and specifically Austen. What are you doing with that kind of work nowadays?
Yeah, so I mean, and we can transition. So the manuscript project required me to travel all over the world to all kinds of archives. So as you can imagine, in 2020, that stopped very abruptly. And so I was finishing up some things, but we had suddenly had a lot of free time on our hands. A lot of us were at home. And so my colleague Emily Kugler at Howard and I started for fun with our friends playing games. And we realized there's a lot of games inspired by the 18th century. And then as Emily and I got further into it, we realized that in particular, there's a lot of Austen games. And we knew this already a little bit because our friends Linda Troost and Sarah Greenfield, who we play 18th century Dungeons and Dragons with, are experts in both Jane Austen and Hollywood, but also Jane Austen games. So we'd heard about, the massive multiplayer online role-playing game Ever Jane and these sorts of things. But we suddenly found all of these indie games that you can play for free online, that some of which are just choose your own adventure versions of Pride and Prejudice or Sense and Sensibility,
Mhm.
where you get to create your own version of Elizabeth Bennet and Fitzwilliam Darcy, for example. And some of which are more like Austen inspired kind of games, where maybe you're uh, building accomplishments for your character, and doing it through Austen trivia, and
Mhm.
then following a romance plot where one is looks a lot like Alan Rickman, and another one is very clearly Fitzwilliam Darcy, and another
Mhm.
one um, is very much in the Charles Bingley, Henry Tilney, affable sunshine guy sort of mold. And we realized that nobody had really been talking about these, which often are trying to do queer readings and experiences, or are trying to be more representative in terms of race.
Mhm.
And at the same time, of course, Bridgerton is blowing up, and we're realizing these games are quite old in the grand scheme of the digital. They're, 5 years old or so. And we could see all the things that were happening now in the Bridgerton moment had already happened and been
Yeah.
discussed by game designers and players a few years earlier. So, like, what would happen if we told Austen people about these dialogues in these games? And that's been kind of what we've been doing with the Critical Prof channel here on YouTube, and in lectures for places like Virtual JaneCon, and published
Mhm.
pieces in academic, venues and that sort of thing. And of course, now I write for the gaming website, Polygon, kind of explaining Austen games for the gamer audience in those sorts of ways.
And I love that they're more inclusive, and they have been for some time. And I guess also fan fiction has also been running that course as well. But uh, do they kind of coincide, the kind of, explosion of fan fiction and also gaming narratives?
Well, it's so interesting. I have a graduate student who's working on Fitzwilliam Darcy as book boyfriend. Her results are yet to be determined, but she's looking through, kind of the tag structure of Archive of Our Own and things like that. What's really tricky, and I've written a little bit about this in my published work about Austen and manuscript culture and fan fiction, is Austen's fandom compared to a lot of other fandoms that we can study kind of lived behind quasi-walled gardens for a long part of its history. So it wasn't like it was completely locked down, but you'd have to learn a login or you'd have to join a Facebook group or these sorts of things. So it's a little bit harder to study change over time and transition in the same way that we can for other fandoms, which is quite interesting. It's an interesting and rich new vein of research that we're just starting to kind of figure out. There's been some work, but the work is often kind of focused in on this, what people erroneously call the professional fanfic. In other words, the stuff that's written and circulated through, like, Kindle Unlimited and things like that, things that are being monetized in those sorts of ways. And my impulse is to think that that's a different story, so to speak, than other kinds of fan fiction. But Austen fandom's always been a little bit different from everybody else. Of course, they've also had a century or more, depending on who you ask, to hone the craft.
And I guess most fandoms will wind up saying that about their own fan, like that, oh, well, yes, we're a little different than other fandoms, because when you really explore it and learn it and kind of are a part of it, it seems like your own family. And Austen's very much like that.
Well, it's interesting because the history of fan fiction, as we kind of think about the core term, is so much the stories that the scholarship, and the scholarship is almost older than I am at this point. It's certainly older than many of my students. Starts with science fiction, and how that kind of community circulated material from the 1920s on. And so the norms would pass from sci-fi fandom to sci-fi fandom, fantasy fandom to fantasy fandom, in a kind of collective folk knowledge. So Babylon 5 fans were behaving according to the same rules as Star Trek fans, X-Files fans, Star Wars fans, all those sorts of things. Jane Austen's kind of off-roading in different kinds of ways, partly because she's in the public domain for the entire history that we know of modern fan fiction. So you can go to market in theory with your material, but also just because there's a different relationship to Austen's own work, what you can do with it, what people are okay with you doing. In different kinds of ways. Weirdly, the other big outlier in terms of the history of fan fiction, beyond the scope of what we're talking about today, is Twilight, which has a very different understanding of how copyright works and how monetization works. Most fan fiction thinks of itself as a kind of public good in ways that, if you can monetize, folks do. But yeah, Jane Austen fan fiction has a long history. Devaney Lozer has argued that the first real person fanfic of Jane Austen happens right after her death. We know that her nieces are trying to continue what we now know as the Watsons at Sanditon. And those continuations are kind of the first home of fan work for Austen, which I think is a little bit different from saying Pride and Prejudice should be, we need a fix-it fic for Pride and Prejudice. I think most readers don't think about it that way. It's more about kind of Pride and Prejudice in space, or Pride and Prejudice, let's look at Georgiana. Pride and Prejudice, let's pay more attention to Charles Bingley sorts of focuses.
Well, we also have the different media, adaptations too that work in kind of similar ways. When you do a television or film adaptation and you kind of add things to it or take characters in different routes, or then do something, but well, she's a
Drop
novel.
someone in a pond,
Yeah.
have a hand flex.
So
Yeah. And those become part of the vocabulary. What's fascinating to me as an educator who's been teaching Austen for half my life now, is the ways in which the touchstones and the things that students are surprised are not present in the novel because they come to it through the film adaptations, is constantly changing. So these days, it's much more Keira Knightley's Pride and Prejudice is still the
yeah,
touchstone, even as it's not insignificantly old at this point.
I don't know.
It feels like yesterday to me.
I mean, it's almost 20 years old
I
now.
know, I'm not doing that math. You can do that math. I'm not doing that math.
um, I'm very fascinated, and maybe we could do this and kind of explore this a bit to finish. I've always been fascinated by the gaming narratives and how narrative in gaming has come to become a very important. I know I have plenty of author friends who have written for video games and this kind of stuff, and they hire real writers to come in and create these narratives for the games. And the way that people who participate in those games kind of experience narrative is for a whole almost two generations now is a different way than I was ever able to experience narrative in some ways, and how that changes the way we see books. Are there, with the 18th century gaming, is it specific narratives that you pursue, and really, are there any games that really take Austen's work and create, like, is there a Pride and Prejudice like role-playing game kind of thing? Yeah.
Yeah, so there's a couple of role-playing games that are trying to make spaces for people to experience Austen. So if you know Austen-land, the movie,
Yeah.
um, the first people who were trying to make Austen games were in the LARP community. That's live action role playing. That's if you've been to Jasna, you're almost there, right? Only imagine everyone's in costume and everyone's in character for multiple days, in family units with different roles, kind of telling a version of the story. Um, LARPs are intensive, right, and take time. They're kind of like a summer camp or
Mhm.
a extended vacation. And so you can do this at home as well. There's been attempts to kind of try to recreate mechanics of Austen's world. The biggest one, one that's best known, is Good Society, which is the Jane Austen RPG. And it has a really great epistolary phase where you write letters to each other. And it has a reputation mechanic. So you're balancing, being daring and trying to achieve your goals, but not in a way that's going to get you in trouble. And of course, you're gossiping against other folks, and you're working in small communities in those kinds of ways. One of my favorite Austen adaptations that's not an Austen adaptation is Dimension 20's actual play, A Court of Fey and Flowers, which came out this year, which combined characters that were mechanically very Dungeons and Dragons. So they were all fairies in the Feywild, but used those reputation and rumor and epistolary modes from Good Society to make this a Regency inflected world. And in fact, two of the player characters very consciously modeled themselves after the Crawford siblings, which
Hmm.
was amazing because you got to see a kind of alternate world of that you realize again, or at least I did as a viewer, oh, right, the Crawfords are really charismatic, and, there's certain parts of them that are delightful, and it's kind of, and in a different genre, in a different kind of space, you are rooting for them in interesting sorts of ways. Um, and the other one that just came out, if you're looking for a kind of spooky version, maybe something like the more mystery inflected sort of adaptations of or continuations of Pride and Prejudice is Chaosium has put out a setting book called Regency Cthulhu, so Call of Cthulhu, so Lovecraftian, one of the best introductions to the Regency period I've read in a setting book. So it's so very Austen in the sense that Austen doesn't have a whole lot of aristocratic characters, and Regency Cthulhu more or less says, I mean, it's really hard for you to play aristocrats. You should play the middling sort, and here's how you do it, and all those sorts of things. And it's a really lovely kind of way of playing with the period and playing in the Austen village sort of space in spooky detective sorts of ways. And then if you don't have a bunch of buddies to play with, on itch.io, Emily and I really love Spiral Atlas's adaptations of Northanger Abbey. That one's complete, and Pride and Prejudice, or I'm sorry, she's renamed it, or they've renamed it Pride or Prejudice, and that one's still in development. But in both of those cases, you pick and reframe the gender, sexuality, and in the case of Pride or Prejudice, the race, and you can also put your Elizabeth Bennet in a wheelchair if you so wish. But you get to explore the actual text in really interesting kinds of ways. My favorite moment was realizing that Emily is Hapa, so she is of Asian descent, and we were looking at the description of Catherine Morland, which we pick at the beginning, and all of the language makes it very clear that she's East Asian. We see her as East Asian. We looked up the text. It is letter perfect from Austen's text. So it blew open the text for us in really interesting ways. It's not what Austen intended, but it's what the text can potentially give us, which I think is really cool.
Yeah, and that's one of the ways that I was going to follow it up to finish with the ways that this kind of immersive experience changes and works with narrative and how you experience it, but that's precisely it.
Yeah, there's a lovely world of all kinds of games for all kinds of players, and it's only growing, and it's so exciting to kind of see the ways that people are literally playing with Austen in ways that I think are really fruitful.
All righty. Well, we've moved quite a ways from my youth playing Avalon Hill games and also choose your own adventure books.
Oh, my Avalon Hill stack is strong and robust.
Yeah.
And just off camera.
Well, this is absolutely wonderful. Thank you so much for talking about this. I'll drop some more. We shared some links already in the chat, and you gave me some other links. I'll make sure I drop those in the comments.
Of course. And I think Eliza Wilcox is working hard in the chat. Thank you.
Great. All right.
As is Rosenbach Museum. Hooray.
Good. Excellent. Well, Emily, this has been wonderful. Thank you so much for
my very great pleasure.
For taking a turn about the room with us today.
Yes.
All righty. It's been a pleasure. Take care, and I hope I will see you again, or maybe we'll get to play some Austen games one day.
Yes, please. I will be in Philly next year, so.
Good. All right. Look me up. Bye-bye.
All right.
Well, everyone, next week for a turnabout the room, Dr. John Mullen will be joining us, author of What Matters in Jane Austen, and he's going to talk about marriage and proposals in Jane Austen novels. And let me take this moment right now to thank all of you for watching this episode and remind you, as a nonprofit organization, the Rosenbach Museum and Library depends on the generosity of friends and supporters like you to keep programs like this free and accessible to hundreds of fellow Austen lovers worldwide, including the 140 so watching the show live right now. If you would like to donate to the Rosenbach, you can do so at our website. You could also become a member. Membership gives you free museum admission, discounts on programs and courses, and exclusive invitations to member-only events. I'll be talking about one of those today that we just had. You can learn more about how to become a member on our website. And at the end of today's show, I'll give a shout out to all of those who have donated or joined as members since last week's episode. There are lots of great in-person and virtual programs and courses at the Rosenbach coming up. Our new winter program and course schedule will be released for members to register next week. And one of the member benefits of the Rosenbach then is a first crack at registering for our great programs and courses. And one of which I will tell you about right now. This is a course coming up, the last of the fall courses coming up right now is, here it is this course called next month, starting a 5-session course on Shakespeare and the Fantastic with Dr. Jim Casey. It will focus on Midsummer Night's Dream, Hamlet, Macbeth, and The Tempest. And I can't wait for this one to begin. It'll be 5 bi-weekly sessions starting December 15 and running into next year. And yes, Austen Mondays merchandise is also still available. You can get yours, get your t-shirts, stickers, and buttons. Visit the Rosenbach website to buy. It is a lot of fun to have these things as well. And as I promote my annotation co-host, I'll also tell you that you can also join us on the Facebook group page, Austen Mondays, for lots more info, news, links, conversation, and fun. We all continue the conversation there, and I hope you will join us there as well. But for today's chapter annotation segment, I want to welcome back my co-host, Kathleen Hudson. Hey, Kathleen.
Hello, good to be back.
Awesome to have you here. I am drinking today because Wickham is coming.
Yes,
I have my Wickham cocktail.
It's a good one this week. I approve of the whiskey wholeheartedly here.
Yeah, every week, everyone, I enjoy a cocktail during the show, a drink that I create a name to tie in with the chapters. And today is the Wickham. It is rye or bourbon whiskey. I used rye, maple syrup, and a little Campari. And it is absolutely delicious. The Wickham cocktail, like the character, is inviting but dangerous, sweet, stylish, flavorful, and not for the faint-hearted. Drink at your own risk.
It's a good winter drink. Now that it's finally gotten cold, it's good.
It is. And actually, I was even wondering tonight if I was even going to ice it, and I would just make it, room temperature. But it is a delicious cocktail. And before we start, Kathleen, we had a ball at the Rosenbach.
Yes.
And I mean a literal ball.
A literal ball. A ball in every sense of the word.
Yeah.
Yes.
And I want to thank everyone who came. And before the show started tonight, I had some a slideshow with some of the photos, and I wanted to just share a couple of those with you all and talk about it briefly. And where is it? There we go. It was a lot of fun. We, danced. Lots of people came in Regency dress, which was really wonderful. Mrs. Pettit was there with myself, and we danced. Although we didn't get any pictures of just the two of us dancing, which I should have told somebody to take a picture. But I had 2 dances with Nicolette. I don't know if Nicolette's watching tonight. If she's not, I'm sure she'll watch the recording. So thank you, Nicolette, for the 2 dances that we had, and thanks to all the other dancers, especially those who enjoy Austen Mondays. I really did have a lot of fun talking and dancing with all of you in person at the Rosenbach, and thanks to the fabulous Sarah Potts who put this program together. Here's, as I was talking, I meant to be sharing pictures of everyone dancing and enjoying in their great gowns. So it was a lot.
Massive gown envy right now. This is
great.
So I'm very jealous.
People really, went all out. Here I am in the circle. Here's Mrs. Pettit back here. We did get to dance some together, though. Here I am with Nicolette. It was she was great to dance with too. So a lot of fun. Boy, it was. I hope we get to do something like this again. Here's the whole crew at the end. Thank you all for coming at the end of the show. I'll also give everybody a shout out as well. And But let us get going with
Yes.
our.
Very fitting we were talking about fan fiction, because we're about to get into a self-insert narrative that's completely divorced from reality. So that's very fair.
We certainly are. Welcome to our chapter annotation segment, everyone. This is introducing Mr. Wickham, and we're going to cover chapters 15 to 17. And first up is chapter, well, yeah, and it's funny. There are a couple things that I want to mention about last week too, like about the 95, because there's a Wickham thing that I have that I would be great to tie in.
I feel like we could easily have an entire like second, third, fourth session just on the 95 adaptation, because we were still clearly going.
Well, the way this chapter 15 begins is we get this Mr. Collins backstory, which
this is one of those things I love about Austen, which is even with characters who she would be antagonists, or she clearly is not super, she still gives in-depth background. I mean, it's one of the things I like about Bronte too, is everyone has, it's not just, you know, awful for the sake of awful. Everyone has their reasons. And she, you know, she's actually a very psychologically astute author, which I don't think is necessarily always appreciated as much in light of all the other stuff.
And I'm especially fascinated because she has set him up as just in a figure of fun, and he will continue that through the novel. But she does give us a backstory about how his character was shaped,
developed. And
it begins, he's not a sensible man, but then the greatest part of his life, having been spent under the guidance of an illiterate and miserly father. He belonged to one of the universities, but didn't form any useful acquaintance there. The subjection in which his father had brought him up had given him originally great humility of manner, but was now a good deal counteracted by the self-conceit of a weak head. So she does say that it's like it's in him. He has a weak character. Living in retirement and the consequential feelings of early and unexpected prosperity. But he is not just a product of his upbringing, or not just a product of his own character, but also of his upbringing.
And she doesn't, again, there's no requirement that she do this. She could just have him be ridiculous, but I do love that she takes time to do that. And I mean, it's interesting too that this description comes again before the Wickham stuff, so that they stand in contrast as these two people, but that they bring up too, you know, the mixture of pride and obsequiousness, self-importance and humility, which in the context obviously of the larger discussion about Darcy and pride, but also about appearance versus reality, you know, that Collins is secretly a very proud person, but he's also very servile, that there's a disconnect there. I think really does get unpacked. It strikes me as so interesting that she would have that, she would place that here in this chapter before Wickham, and not in the last chapter where we were actually like introduced
when he's introduced. Because we were asking these questions, and we were a couple weeks ago, we were talking about him. It was like, why does he behave this way? And then we were thinking of reasons like, well, he doesn't have, he and his father didn't have as much money as the Bennets had, so he's kind of, you know, doesn't feel like he really belongs, but he does. But then Austen does actually address
I think it's deliberate. I think it's
a different way.
But she's definitely drawing that parallel.
And then his seeking for
his plans.
his plans now with the family, which has only been hinted at, but he hasn't said out loud, nor is the narrator. That he wants to marry one of the daughters, but there's an if he found them as handsome and amiable as represented, and that this is his excessively generous, you know, way to fix everything. This is his contrition for it's atonement for entailment is what it is, in a sense, that he believes that he is atoning for an injustice that may have done them. But of course, it's all completely dependent upon his own selfish, you know, desire. That like only if he finds them worthy of marrying him and that he would benefit from it, that he would do that. So,
very disinterested churchman here.
Yes.
Yes.
No, I mean he thought it an excellent plan and excessively generous and disinterested in his own part. And that's the great irony of Austen. It's because we know it's the opposite. He's not generous at all, and he is completely self-interested in it.
And I think it's interesting too, not to jump ahead, but again, in comparison with Wickham and his professional aspirations and his professional realities, interesting to bring up again this excessively generous and disinterested, but not really man of the cloth, which was obviously what Wickham was allegedly destined for.
He tells Mrs. Bennet has an hour's tete-a-tete with her, a quarter of an hour's tete-a-tete, and I'm sure 14 minutes of it was talking about Rosings anyway. And then about 1 minute was how he was going to, marry one of the daughters and bring her to Rosings, or the parsonage outside of Rosings. Mrs. Bennet likes this, and suddenly, he's not a bad guy anymore, as she was damning him before. Now she's, now he's not the bad guy that she had said that he would. The man whom she could not bear to speak of the day before was now high in her good graces.
Yes. And the way she works through just, she trusted that she might soon have 2 daughters married. It's like just ticking the box. Yep. I got to get rid of all of them. So just take what you need here. And
the kind of, he wants Jane, and, she says, well, Jane, has a chance with Bingley. She says she might be engaged. So, and he just moves right down the line.
Yeah. Elizabeth has always been slightly the problem child, so we'll go with that. Yes, equally next.
Mrs. Bennet recommends Elizabeth, and he goes right to her anyway. And I think we know that marriage, and especially, and we'll get this a lot from Charlotte Collins later, or from Charlotte Lucas later in the book.
Spoiler alert, Charlotte Collins.
We get this from Charlotte, how Charlotte's very practical about marriage. And that's a reality. It really is.
Yes.
Not everyone, especially then, could afford to just choose whoever they fell in love with. That's impractical actually for most people then, in order to get married and be successful in life. And so on the one hand, that's a practicality of the age, that if he says, I want to marry one daughter and she's not available, that he move on to the next. But Austen really points it out and plays it up as it's also a sign that he's not a good suitor, that he's not a good.
Can move from one to the next very easily.
To be married. So, and she'll play that up throughout this novel, about how it matters how you feel about who you are going to marry. But we'll get
as opposed to the marriage market as an economic market.
Yeah. All right. So that's set up, and he's good. We know that now. And then and now all the daughters are going to walk to Meryton. Yeah.
I appreciate poor Mr. Bennet being like, please just get out of my house, because I can't do this anymore. If you don't take him out of my house now, I shall run amok.
I like how he's in there. Is it here, or maybe it's later, that he's spending all the time, and Mr. Collins needs his. Mr. Collins likes to nominally engage with one of the largest folios in the collection. I like that he goes and he finds the biggest book in the library.
Yes, that must be an indication that I am
a big book. Yeah. Mr. Collins likes big books, and he cannot lie.
He cannot lie. But he doesn't really like Caroline Bingley, he does not actually like the books. He likes picking up the books and being seen to be reading the book, but does not read the book.
No, he's talking instead of really looking at the book. Every sister except Mary agreed to go to Meryton, which is interesting because everybody always says, why doesn't Mary go for Mr. Collins? In the novel, Mary wants no parts of him either.
No. I do think that's an unfair thing that now several adaptations have done, which is, who would be a good pairing for Mr. Collins? Mary, because they're both insufferable in the same way. But I don't think there's any indication in the book that she finds him any better than anyone else does.
No, and that's with the 95 Pride and Prejudice. If when you watch it, just watch Mary in the scenes that she's in. She's always looking at him. She kind of wants to be noticed. At one point, Jane uses Mary to get Mr. Collins away from him.
Yes.
Mary wanted to talk to you about some of Fordyce's
the Fordyce sermons distraction.
They bring him in, and Mary wants him to notice her, and he doesn't at all. But that's an adaptation choice.
Yeah. Well, I feel like it's something too they repeat in the I can't remember what year. Was it 2006 Keira Knightley one?
2005.
2005. Yeah. They repeat that and that, and I'm like, I'm not sure you're not basing this off the 95 version. So
well, they get to town, and here he is.
Here he is, as it should be. Here he is.
And they see Denny, Mr. Denny. It's funny, in 95, he's always just Denny.
Yes, yeah.
Hear Lydia calling him Denny. It's Mr. Denny, and he has another man with him, and he introduces his friend, Mr. Wickham. And the young man wanted only regimentals to make him completely charming.
Yes.
What does it say? All the best parts of beauty, a fine countenance, a good figure, and a very pleasing address, and a happy readiness of conversation. He is, he's noticed by every lady.
Yes.
He is very much the most charming man in this novel from this description, which is very much Elizabeth's point of view. And that'll become more evident as we go along.
Yeah. Well, it's an interesting, I think there's even a line, and of course I can't find it now, but that it's all as it should be, that there's a way to perform that. This entire kind of section, that these chapters are extraordinarily interesting for me, because I work a little bit in narrative theory. So I'm always just interested in the subjective narrative. And I think it's never more obvious than in these chapters where, you really are getting very nearly free and direct discourse on Elizabeth's part. And then you're getting the inset narrative from Wickham, which I think is extraordinarily circumspect. And that this is a book, again, about reading superficial stuff and having that not line up with what's under the surface.
Yeah.
So the fact that he is perfect on the surface, I think, is a fairly clear indicator that it's not, but certainly that Elizabeth is primed to see that and then have it reinforced when Darcy shows up, and they both have that reaction. So
here's my thing with the BBC 95. A perfectly good actor playing Wickham, Adrian Lucas. Very good.
I know what you're going to say, and I have the same. Yeah,
but he's not this dashing.
No.
Wickham that I get in the novel. He seems like affable, a little goofy, a little. He doesn't seem. There's no note of danger, I think, in him, and maybe that's their choice.
I feel like it must be tricky for adaptations, because you don't necessarily want someone who's going to compete with Darcy for lead appearance.
But they should, and see, I think that's.
But he should, yes,
especially in the 95.
Because this ought to be. The effect is that, instantly half the town is in love with them, and the other half is well on their way to being in love with him, because he's so charming. Like everything on the surface is perfect. Which again, I think is so interesting in sort of the larger scheme of that. And we see echoes of him again in Sense and Sensibility, that this character who can move very freely through society, but who is a danger, and you don't know that until it's revealed. This appearance versus reality, and also the exchange within the community of, we accept this person, but are we accepting him for the right reasons? Are we accepting him because he has a pleasing address, and he's saying all the right things at the right times, or are we accepting him because he performs well, or because he is good? That's not lining up.
That's what we'll see as we go along with their meeting here. But
I quite agree that it's one of those ones where it's like,
I think they have no quite. I think the actors themselves had no real chemistry. Adrian Lucas and Jennifer Ehle, I don't think they really had, like, when you see them together on the screen, and it's not a matter of editing or what looks that they're using, there doesn't seem to be any chemistry.
No.
But I wonder, like, in a real kind of, behind the scenes kind of thing reason, Jennifer Ehle and Colin Firth became romantically involved during
Right.
that.
Yeah.
And I wonder if that's the kind of, so it was very easy for them to look and see, have that
Probably, yeah.
kind of,
I do feel like the Wickham in the 95 is a little bit of an aw shucks kind of,
yeah.
you know, not, you're right, not with that element of danger. You never did feel like anyone was in very grave danger of that.
And I bring all this up too, to kind of stress the point here that, you know, he's a super, I mean, the text presents him as, it's not just Elizabeth interested in him. So we do get her point of view, but it's more than him just being the new guy too. He is definitely good looking, charming. He's the guy that all the women are looking at as soon as he comes on the scene.
And him getting a uniform is just, again, icing on the cake. But again, superficial and a performance.
Mm-hmm. Well, just after they meet him, Bingley and Darcy appear on the scene, and Elizabeth and this is Elizabeth, she notices this, that they give a look to each other. Well, first Darcy is trying not to fix his eyes on Elizabeth, which I love that little detail.
Again, having realized that he is in danger, but unable to disentangle himself.
Always talked about.
He's doing the very mature thing of, if I pretend she's not here, she can't hurt me.
But then when he sees Wickham, and then Wickham, they looked at each other, and she was astonished because they both changed. One looked white, the other red.
I like that it's not specified. That I mean, we can maybe guess, but we can't guess because it's both changed color. One looked white, one looked red, and one would imply that white's fear, red is anger, but you don't know who.
You could make the case either way. Like white could be like just revulsion or astonishment. It could be, you know, and red could be embarrassment, but red could also be anger.
So that one, we don't know who's doing what, and two, even if we knew, we couldn't judge white versus red here. And
a good reminder too that you know, we're not going to give any spoilers away, but the text doesn't as well. The text is being a little abstract here, and just letting us know that there's something serious between these two people.
And we don't really know any more than Elizabeth does at that moment.
And then we're introduced, and then they part, and then we get Mrs. Phillips, who is Mrs. Bennet's sister, in every sense of the word. This would be like, I imagine this would be Mrs. Bennet in town, and how. And again, I appreciate her depiction in the 95 version, really as a compatriot of you know, very, very much that interplay, I think is a very underrated part of that, of the Mrs. Phillips character. And the first Mrs. Phillips we get is she throws up the parlor window and loudly second the invitation, screaming from her window,
yell out into the street. That's great.
And there's this little moment here which I'm also fascinated by, that, well, first of all, she's setting up her house like Mrs. Bennet wants to set up her house. She wants all the eligible men to come there, and her husband has to go and introduce himself. And the same thing happens, even though there's no daughters here to be introduced to. And we'll get to maybe why Mrs. Phillips does this. But before that, I love this detail that she happened to see Mr. Jones's shop boy in the street, who had told her that they were not to send any more drafts, this would be medicine, to Netherfield, because the Miss Bennets were come away. And another moment in the novel where we see those, you know, systems of information.
Yes. Yeah. And again, a really interesting and important thing, I think, that Austen makes a point of inbuilding into her ongoing narrative, that there's stuff happening behind the scenes that you may not be seeing, but that this is a community, and that communication occurs through community relationships, which again, I think makes it very telling, troubling, interesting, important, that when Elizabeth does get Wickham's story, there's this air of secrecy to it, that she's the only one who knows, and that's potentially problematic, and that you know, that doesn't fit into gossip. I'm a huge gossip apologist, and that maybe makes me a Mrs. Phillip and Mrs. Bennet apologist too. But I think certainly Austen is aware that while there are times when gossip is untrue and times when gossip is immoral, that it is very powerful and that is very important for social moderations. And that is one of those things that, to sort of paraphrase Bridgerton a little bit, that is a tool for women to moderate identity in it's one of the few ones that they have sufficient recourse to make sure everyone's doing what they're supposed to be doing all the time.
Yeah. And it's the way of knowing or finding out what everyone is doing in a sense, or just finding information. We had in the very beginning, first episode, I think maybe people were asking, how do people know how much money, these people?
So it's worth a year. Yeah.
Because people talk about it in ways that Mrs. Phillips even finds out that her niece is no longer sick through, someone who worked
the
apothecary and then knows, this information about, someone, about her family that's living at Longbourn, that people know your business.
And also that it's a cognitive kind of process of, they're not sending medicine to Netherfield Hall. I guess that means Jane is okay and that she's back home. Like that there's a logical process too of reading someone's social situation.
So they go home. Mrs. Phillips invites them all back, but now they're going to go home first. And Elizabeth tells Jane the look that she saw. Of course, Jane, would have defended both because that's what Jane does. And we'll see her reaction more later too. And Mr. Collins, on his return, highly gratified Mrs. Bennet by admiring Mrs. Phillips' manners and politeness, except Lady Catherine and her daughter. He had never seen a more elegant woman. Now, we've seen Mrs. Phillips shouting out the window, and she's all interested in bringing all the officers over. She's not elegant.
No. But I think it does speak to, there's a role even for the Mr. Collinses of Austen's world that they function. They clearly serve a function of reinforcing against some assumption about behavior. That this is polite. Yes, we're gonna pretend like this is all correct, but still there's a ranking system. And except my esteemed patroness, Lady Catherine de Bourgh, that it's enforcing things even as it's undermining them. Weirdly.
Does he also operate in the woman's world of passing information in this world?
Yeah.
He doesn't behave like the other men do.
No.
He's out giving gossip all the time.
Yeah.
About people in these ways.
And again, I think his role within just in the abstract as a clergyman within the parish, he would know and be invited to every household during specific times in everyone's life. So the understanding is that, yes, he would be central to any kind of gossip that would, as a messenger from one house to another, because that's his job, is basically to go from place to place. That he is functioning in a very interesting way in that respect.
Well, they go off to again the Phillips house, and Mr. Collins just talks about how everything compares to Rosings, which again is ridiculous. I think, just for readers, this is the way you're supposed to read. Like, he's describing this enormous, gorgeous, mansion that has giant rooms, and it's the richest place you can imagine living in, and he's just comparing it to someone's town.
And it does have the effect too of making Lady Catherine a character before she's introduced. That she's sort of hanging over everything at the same time. And by extension, too, that Darcy is to a certain extent hanging over everything because they're connected.
And then it says he found in Mrs. Phillips a very attentive listener, whose opinion of his consequence increased with what she heard, and who was resolving to retail it all among her neighbors as soon as she could. And this is what I finally realized. Mrs. Bennet wants the officers and eligible men to come to her house to marry her daughters. Mrs. Phillips wants to be the center of information, that this is a very important post for her, for a woman in Meryton, is if she can get everyone to come to her house, she learns about everything and then she gets to pass it on. And a person of consequence.
Yes. And an arbiter of taste by extension, because she's heard all about the, I love that it's to the girls who could not listen to their cousin. I'm like, not who don't want to listen to their cousin.
Yeah.
It's like, could not stand it anymore. Shh, take him away.
I mean, up to the whole walkover.
Yeah. Cannot do it. Do not want.
Well, the gentlemen come in, and again, and also the Collins is there with the women because he arrived, and the men are already together. They've eaten, and they're off by themselves. So he's not even with the men when he gets there. He's only with the women. The gentlemen come in, including Mr. Wickham, and Elizabeth felt that she had neither been seeing him before nor thinking of him since with the smallest degree of unreasonable admiration. I mean, what a
Yeah, and not to undermine the Wickham thing, but too with Mr. Collins, the sense that he sticks with the women because he can impress the women, he can communicate with the women, whereas Wickham comes in and he is elevated kind of as a man among men. So that, again, by contrast, and I love that she uses, I think, Collins and Wickham and interplays between those two as, here's both ends of the spectrum. Collins is with the women and Wickham, oh, what a man, what a guy.
Far beyond the Moen person countenance, air and walk. So almost every female eye was turned, and Elizabeth was the happy woman by whom he finally seated himself. He goes right for Elizabeth, which I think says something about, obviously her looks, but more importantly, that she probably looks like a person of consequence, in that, especially in the town, that her family lives on the bigger estate, Longbourn, and she probably looks like a lady who may have means to herself.
With missile-like accuracy, has found.
Yep.
But interestingly, hasn't gone for Jane. Has gone for Elizabeth instead.
Yeah, we don't get. I don't think we get Jane at all in this chapter. We get her in the next, but
but especially coming again after Mr. Collins was like, Jane, no Elizabeth, no, whichever one's next on the list.
Yeah.
That he hones in on that. Plus his ability to render even the most threadbare topic interesting, because he's that skilled at speaking. He really is in many ways, again, Darcy's opposite in that respect, just being able to perform interesting and perform charming to such an extent that it's turning straw into gold basically in conversation speak.
Well, while Lydia is busy being involved in this game called Lottery Tickets, if you don't know, it's a card game, and one of them is the card that you want. That's like getting the lottery, and you bet. And they later they'll mention the fish, and that's the.
When I read this as a teenager, I thought they meant actual fish, and it took me a minute to understand that it's little fake fish boats. Yeah, I was just like, you get fish from this? Gosh, they really weren't like us. Yeah.
And so, because Lydia is interested in the game, Mr. Wickham is at leisure to talk to Elizabeth, and she was very willing to hear him. But she really wants to hear, what the heck is up with you and Darcy? Because I saw that look.
And again, I feel like, as with Darcy, she should probably be flagging this as maybe something she should be aware of, that she has a very interesting man sitting next to her, very charming. And what she wants to talk about, she wants to talk about, is Mr. Darcy and his relationship with him. So, and she's not aware at all. Like people, we've talked about this. That is you in danger, girl.
Is she really interested in Darcy? And of course, she says no. And the text kind of and I think because it's frequently her point of view, the text says no, she's not interested in him, but yet she meets this super attractive guy, and he's sitting there to talk to her, and she wants to know about him already, that there is something that she's not acknowledging in herself, that she wants to know all about Darcy, even when she's insulting him and saying all kinds of awful things.
She still wants to know.
Yeah, and she at first understands, the politeness of society. She dared not even mention him. Like, I can't just.
Yes, this is very interesting back and forth.
But yet, Wickham brings him up. He says, you might have seen the cold manner of our meeting yesterday, and maybe this is one of the reasons why he has sought her out. Maybe he noticed that she saw them look at each other like that. So he's like, this is somebody who, well, and Bingley greeted the sisters. So this is
and it says he began the subject. But and that asking in a hesitating manner. I've just finished teaching Othello for my freshman students, so I'm very like hyper focused on the linguistic tricks that you do. Oh, I'll ask the question, but in a hesitating manner, like in a leading question thing. And I think she is very much doing that, playing with the teasing. Teasing the information out, and Wickham not wanting to blurt it out because that would take away from some of the credibility of the story he's going to then present, but structuring it so brilliantly, really.
He tests the waters first.
Yes.
I saw there was a Darcy there. Has he been staying here long? We don't get his exact quote, and then she tells him, and then and then he kind of
she probes, and then he responds,
and then. But her response is, in the world that they're in, is not one that she's supposed to be making. That I spent time with him, and I think him very disagreeable. Now, in our contemporary age, it's okay to give your opinion about someone like that, but in this world where people talk about, everybody knows things, and it's not a positive characteristic in her that she's willing to talk negatively about someone to someone else behind the scenes.
In fact, even Wickham kind of almost chides her on it, which is, it's your opinion of him would in general astonish, and perhaps you would not express it quite so strongly anywhere else. Here you are in your own family. So basically you're saying something that at most you should only say to your family. This you don't really know me as much. And also that he declines to give that initial opinion. I have no right to give my opinion. I'm not qualified to form one. Is an interesting, especially given what we then the story he spins, that he's not going to jump on that, and he's not going to give his opinion right away, and that he's almost going to chide her for overstepping. Was interesting to me.
And if I had given someone this quote from Elizabeth about Darcy, he is not at all liked in Herefordshire. Everybody is disgusted with his pride. You will not find him more favorably spoken of by anyone. If I asked people who that quote was without being in this chapter, I wonder how many people would guess it's Mrs. Bennet.
Right. And
she sounds so much like her mother in the things that she's saying here. And I don't think, she certainly doesn't realize that she's doing that.
No.
And, but that's where she's at right now. She is in a position that we've read the scenes with her mother and how disagreeable she was, like to Darcy's face. Elizabeth is doing it behind his back.
Which is
else. Which is also
less defensible.
And Mrs. Bennet also does that when she's been, telling everybody how awful Darcy is.
But she has the courage of her conviction. She will also say it to his face. So, I find that maybe not admirable, but better than what this seems to be, because she doubles down, instead of pulling back, she doubles down. And I don't think that's and then Wickham says it's basically the world is blinded by his fortune and consequence, or frightened by his high and imposing manners, and sees him only as he chooses to be seen, which is a very ironic thing coming from Wickham, but also this assumption that identity and character is really built from how people perceive you, not from any kind of depth of feeling or depth of identity, blah, blah, blah. Yes.
And that's also him daring her, isn't it? It's like, the whole world wouldn't dare to say anything against him, but you're not like the whole world.
He takes something which I think is positive about her character and kind of twists it into something less pleasant, because she is a little bit of a rebel and a radical and doesn't care what the world thinks. And now she seems to be,
he's preying upon that. He's preying upon that on.
Yes. He's preying upon her willingness to do that again, even in this rather unflattering circumstance, because she is saying stuff that she shouldn't. And yet kind of setting them both up as these secret rebels who are seeing things that they don't, see. Again, I see so many echoes of Willoughby and Wickham from Sense and Sensibility. This secret unholy alliance they're building.
Well, Wickham starts to tell the story, and again, it teases out of him, he suffered this great ill usage, and his behavior to myself has been scandalous.
Yeah, really brutal accusations.
Well, then he leaves it, and Elizabeth found the interest of the subject increase and listened with all her heart, but the delicacy of it prevented further inquiry. Like, he knows that he's getting her interested to hear this story. Yeah. She can't say, go on, but he will then go on.
Yeah. And his accusations are quite shocking too, especially, that scandalous, disappointing the hopes and disgracing the memory of his father. Again, this is the language of the Gothic. He's setting him up not just as someone who isn't a nice person, and in fairness, all Elizabeth said was everyone's disgusted by his pride. That's what he's saying now is actually villainy. He's a villain. He's a disgrace. He has done crime. And
he says the church ought to have been his profession, and then a little bit later, I cannot myself accuse of having really done anything to deserve to lose Darcy's, goodwill. I have a warm, unguarded temper. I
do think there's an interesting line here. He says, Mr. Darcy chose to doubt it or to treat it as merely a conditional recommendation, and to assert that I had forfeited all claim to it by extravagance, imprudence, in short, anything or nothing. Because of course that is to a certain extent valid, but that he sort of dismisses it as anything or nothing, as if, he accused me of things and maybe I did them or maybe they don't matter.
Yeah.
Is I think hedging in such an interesting way linguistically of, but whatever he could have accused me of was nothing or anything.
The real accusation is, he says it's not about anything about the deal with a legal thing. It is a man of honor who is, and a man of honor would not have done this, making the accusation then that Darcy is dishonorable, which is that's his entire character as as a gentleman in society, is all dependent upon his honor. And this is the thing that Wickham accuses him of right away, and Elizabeth knows it. She's like, it's quite shocking. He deserves to be publicly disgraced.
But that too, that's an interesting, because again, we've seen throughout Austen, and we'll, not to spoil any future chapters, but we'll continue to see in this text, again, this is a world of gossip. This is a world where public perception needs to moderate behavior, because if you are disgraced, you are not allowed to be in situations where you can then disgrace others. You're not allowed in polite society where you can hurt the vulnerable. But the only way to kind of do that is to tell people what someone else has done. But when stuff is buried, when stuff's hidden, then the system kind of breaks down. So this entire system of gossip, this is operating at the same, it is still gossip, but it is operating underneath the normal kind of web of exchange, and it's making it kind of dangerous here.
And the way, and then Wickham will say, well, I can't forget his father. I wouldn't expose him. We don't have to if you've got someone else willing to do it.
Well, and this is another thing, to make it a point of honor as opposed to a legal matter is also very nebulous. If it's something you can bring up to a court of law, then you can bring it up into a court of law. But if it's a point of honor, that's very perception based. So that he is on ground that he feels safe in, because he doesn't need to go into specifics or prove anything to anyone necessarily. He can just say it. And his narrative is the only thing that's currently in focus. So his narrative is the only one his narrative dominates it.
And Elizabeth's reaction to that is Elizabeth honored him, Wickham, for such feelings and thought him handsomer than ever as he expressed them.
There is nothing cuter than just an honorable man. Nothing more attractive here.
I've been wronged, but I'm not going to seek revenge.
No, just ugh.
Well, but in her favor too, she suddenly realizes what's going on in a sense, or at least logically, or about what the story is. And her first question is, well, what can have been his motive? And that's the right question to ask.
Yes.
Wait a minute. Well, what is his motive for all this?
She is a very good reader. She reads in depth.
Yeah.
She wants to know the why, not just the what.
And he's got to think on his feet now.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
He's got to think like, well, he hates me. That's why.
Yeah.
Oh, and
he's jealous. I mean, have you seen me? Like, who wouldn't be jealous?
I now have the
no ego here.
Yeah.
And I'm so modest too.
And she doesn't think that's, that like, I didn't think he was that bad. And she says, I did not suspect him of descending to such malicious revenge, such injustice, such inhumanity as this.
Yeah.
And then she continues, I do remember his boasting one day at Netherfield at the implacability of his resentments and of his having an unforgiving temper. He didn't say that.
No, you said that about him.
Yes, he said, my good opinion once lost is lost forever, which is not the same thing.
Of him having an unforgiving temper. Yeah.
That is, her interpretation of it. And I love how Austen is creating this character of Elizabeth, who is, it's not like she's perfect and Darcy's not, and he needs to change. These are real characters who both have to understand. I mean, she perfects this later in Emma. Like, Emma is the perfect novel, and how this character has to transform herself.
But she's
some of that here.
Bless her. She never has a heroine who does not have flaws.
Yeah.
That needs. And again, well, she is a romance writer in many ways. It's never flat or one-dimensional characters. It's always the prime thing is always the heroine's journey from one point to another.
Mm-hmm.
I do appreciate too that Wickham says that I can hardly be just to him, and I'm like, yes, no, you can't.
Well, and she could have had a young man too, like you, whose very countenance may vouch for your being amiable. I mean, she doesn't say this, but this is what she's thinking, that his
and again, it's a problem with reading, because we're still stuck on the surface. That what you see should be what you get, but that's not the way any of this actually works.
Mm-hmm. Well, now we get this discussion of pride, which is very fascinating. Obviously,
yes,
we've got this discussion at home with the sisters. We've had it with Darcy and Elizabeth. Now
I think Wickham is surprisingly circumspect about it.
Yeah.
In this,
because Elizabeth thinks that his pride would. I wonder that the very pride of this Darcy has not made him just to you. That you'd think that if he was that proud, that he wouldn't have done this, thing to him, because that would have affected his reputation.
Yeah. Which is, again, interesting, because she's accidentally on purpose maybe echoing Darcy's earlier thing about pride, which is, yes, vanity, obviously female vanity is a falling, but there are times when pride, can be a good thing. And she has said, well, at the very least, you think it would push him not to be dishonest or not stoop to a certain level.
I'd love this down, because Wickham again has to think on his feet. He's like, oh, okay, well, actually, yes, because he is, he does take care of his tenants, family pride, filial pride, and then he
sounds lovely. Like, this character, this is great. He has all the important points, or should be.
But then he brings in the sister. Darcy's younger sister, we haven't met yet. No, we're not going to give anything away that's happened in later in the novel. But the fact then that he brings someone else in to kind of prove his point, and then does nothing but belittle her. She's not amiable. She's very, very proud. She used to like me, and now
she doesn't. Yeah.
So,
and again, this whole, well, I can't say anything. I shouldn't give my opinion. I shouldn't gossip. Let me now drag these people through the mud. It's libel. So,
and then here's the the final question Elizabeth asked, and then she'll bring up with Jane later in the next chapter too, is like, wait a minute, how can Mr. Bingley, who seems good humor itself, and is
he's basically a human golden retriever, is
be in friendship? Like, how would, like, hey, dogs know, right? Dogs know if you're good or bad.
They do. Bingley's know what you are.
How would Bingley be his friend then? And all she can come up with is, well, he can't know who Mr. Darcy is then.
Yeah. Somehow Bingley, Darcy's best friend, can't know that, but I, person who has met him twice and is now getting a bunch of slander from someone else, obviously has a full grasp of his character. And
then Wickham, and Wickham's then just like, well, he's rich.
Yeah. And again, Elizabeth is just a little bit too confident in her own intelligence for this to work. Yeah.
So she asks the right questions. She understands, she hears this story and she asks the right questions to get it right, but she can't get past of we'll see in the next chapter.
And it suits her narrative. It suits her narrative, and she's built up an idea of him, and this fits it, so she'll stick with it.
And he gives her a little more information too about Lady Catherine de Bourgh and how she's actually Darcy's aunt, which Elizabeth hadn't known. And then he talks about her daughter, Miss de Bourgh, Lady Catherine's daughter, and how she's intended for Darcy, and which makes Elizabeth smile as she thinks of, Caroline Bingley. Not going to get what she wants.
Again, that seemed like a very sharp, thing of poor Miss Bingley, vain and useless.
And then Elizabeth even just goes as far as to guess about Lady Catherine de Bourgh, in spite of,
because Mr. Collins speaks so well of her, she can't possibly be anything other than arrogant and conceited. Now,
she may be right, but the fact that she would then be so assertive and it's one thing
and
to
say
talk to
it.
Someone, it's one thing to talk to someone and figure them out. It's another thing to figure someone else out through this person that you talk to, and Mr. Collins in this case.
She's what my grandmother would call someone's been sleeping in the knife box or something. She's very sharp in this one. Very, very cutting in this.
Well, this chapter ends with Elizabeth allowed that Wickham had given a very rational account of it. No, he didn't.
No.
there's a great.
I'm glad you'll allow it, but no.
Yeah. There's a great free and direct discourse on this. That this is all Elizabeth's point of view. That he had given a rational account. He hasn't really explained anything. And then Wickham gets to talk to the others. She gave the rest of the ladies their share of Mr. Wickham's attention. So after cards was over, which was nice. Elizabeth went away with her head full of him. She could think of nothing but of Mr. Wickham and what he had told her all the way home. So now she goes home. This is chapter 17. And now it's again continuing this, systems of passing of information. She goes right to Jane. This is the next day, and she tells him all about the conversation she had with Wickham. And she can't believe it. Like, can you believe that Darcy's this horrible? Or if Jane is like, of course he can't be. This is impossible.
Yeah. Jane's like, no, I don't believe it. Of course I don't believe it.
They're both. They've been
being rhetorical, but I can't believe it. Well, and I love too that this is set up as, oh, Jane, isn't she so sweet / naive?
Yeah.
But she's not, again, incorrect, which is this isn't lining up with what I know. You won't that great line, laugh as much as you choose, but you will not laugh me out of my opinion. That in this, Jane is the stronger character, for sure. And that she has great personal fidelity and a rational state. Like, she's the one being rational here.
And Jane asked the same question that Lizzie had, like, well, what about Bingley? Like, you're describing someone that we know is good. Why would Bingley like him? And again, they get to, the same conclusion, like, can he be so deceived?
Yeah.
And
But
Elizabeth's names, facts, everything mentioned without ceremony. You know, he
yeah.
didn't really give any facts.
No, but that she says, I can much more easily believe Mr. Bingley's being imposed on than that Mr. Wickham should invent such a history for himself as he gave me last night. Again, I think she is coming. She has a reason for this, which is Bingley's lovely and very, but that doesn't mean he's stupid. But she has read it as he's someone who is so nice, like Jane is, that he'll be imposed upon. But that doesn't follow. Those two aren't necessarily connected. And you know, not believing that Mr. Wickham should invent such a history of himself. In fairness, again, to Lizzie's mindset, that is a massive imposition. That's a con, to invent an entire history and try to pass it off. Like the Spanish Inquisition, we probably shouldn't expect people to do that. But she's wrong. She you can see where she is, I think, coming from a semi-logical reading of it, but it's not quite lined up there.
Well, she says that it's, you know, besides there was truth in his looks. And this is, I mean, are Elizabeth and Jane any different in this respect right here now? The way Jane accepts people and the way Elizabeth is accepting someone. Now, Elizabeth doesn't accept Darcy, so there's their difference.
No. And also this, let Mr. Darcy contradict it.
Yeah.
He's not going to contradict it because you're not going to tell him about it. This isn't something we're going to confront him on because we've already kind of made this decision to not mention it again, I guess.
Well, then it's that one knows exactly what to think, Elizabeth says. And that's, you know,
prejudice.
Yeah, that is. I mean, and she is prejudged.
Yes.
Darcy, she has prejudged Wickham by his looks and his manner and the way he expresses things.
Yeah. And she's even prejudged then to that point Bingley and Jane and everyone else who has an opinion. She's discounted different opinions and different positions.
Well, the chapter ends. Bingley shows up. Well, first the two young ladies were summoned from the shrubbery. Python earlier. The Bingley and his sisters come and to invite them for the long expected ball at Netherfield. That'll happen. You know, we'll talk about that next week. Elizabeth's reaction is she thought with pleasure of dancing a great deal with Mr. Wickham and of seeing a confirmation of everything in Mr. Darcy's look and behavior. So,
well, and once again, she's maybe having her own romance, but she still can't quite disentangle from right. Darcy. Also, Mr. Collins interjects with his own interruption here.
First, even Mary could assure her family that she had no disinclination for the ball. Even Mary wants to.
Even Mary, we love a ball in this family.
But Elizabeth tries to tease Mr. Collins about dancing. She's like, oh, well, I guess we're going to a ball as a clergyman. You won't like dancing. And she walks right into that.
Well, to a certain extent, again, she has sort of set herself up for this whole thing for a bunch of misreadings. So I think it's only fair that her teasing would eventually have an immediate blowback for her.
Yeah. And Mr. Collins immediately says, oh, well, I will take the opportunity of soliciting the first two dances from you. And she's, oh, can't believe it.
Walked right into it.
I mean, he would have done it anyway. But,
yeah. I mean, and it's good too. I think that she's forewarned and forearmed about what Mr. Collins is.
Yeah. Now is when she's realizing it. It now first struck her that she was selected from among her sisters as worthy of being the mistress of Hunsford Parsonage.
She's got other fish to fry at this moment than Darcy.
Yeah, and this I love this moment here too. The like this is another moment of this, you know, free and direct discourse. This is Elizabeth's point of view we're getting. It says Mr. Wickham's happiness and her own was perforce delayed a little longer. So, you know, this is all her point of view. Yeah. Even though we're getting to this in, you know, third person here. And we don't get the details, but you know, she heard Mr. Collins's frequent attempt at a compliment on her wit and vivacity. which is, I mean, I can imagine what kind of awful compliments he's trying to.
Yeah, it's like the shark in Jaws. Not seeing it is somehow worse.
Yes, his
Can imagine.
elegant little compliments. I'm sure he's been every moment that they're not together
In the mirror,
writing things
practicing.
down. He's trying to, what can I say about her being witty? You know, and she says, "No, I don't want to dance with you."
Nope.
And she has to dance with him.
Yes,
I mean, this would be completely scandalous if she said no, not only because he is her cousin, he's related to her, but just as a,
not done. Yeah.
She's got no reason to say no, so she can't do it.
First call for dances gets the dance. So
Yep. So be careful who you talk to before the dance. So,
yeah. So and again, as much as she has been sounding off to Wickham, she is still constrained in these final moments by the boundaries.
I didn't fall for it. Before we went to the Rosenbach ball, I asked my wife, I said,
good, see,
I want the first dance. And
forward planning. Yeah.
So
forward planning. At least 2 dances.
Yes. So, well, Jane-ites, thank you all for tuning in today. Thanks to our show sponsor, Lisa Washington. Thanks to all of you who have donated over the last week. Your support helps us bring this show to everyone, create other one-of-a-kind programs and courses, and also helps us care for our collections at the Rosenbach. And specifically, I want to thank Michelle H. from Philadelphia, who donated, and Ann O. from Woodside, New York. And you can also become a member of the Rosenbach and don't even need to live around here, because Kathleen O. of Central Falls, Rhode Island became a member this week. Rosenbach membership gives you free museum admission, discounts on programs and courses, and exclusive invitation to member-only events. You can learn more about how to become a member on our website. And one of our great member-only events was just this past weekend when we had the Rosenbach Ball. And I know for a fact that a couple people joined just so they could come to the ball and had fun. So I have a list of names, people at the ball. I don't think I got them all. So if I don't have your name here, I'm sorry. Send me your name. Say, hey, Ed, you didn't say me too. But Cassandra, Nicolette, Mario, and Sarah, Tammy and Earl, Katie, Melinda, and Isabella, Teresa, Suzanne, Kitty, Debbie, Erin, Caitlin, Victoria, Sheila, and Jamie, and my wife, Kate. Thank you all for coming to the Rosenbach Ball and dancing. Remember, we have an Austen Mondays Facebook group where we can continue the conversation. Look us up on Facebook and join in that conversation. And if you haven't already done so and watching this, like this video, subscribe to the channel. That helps us gain greater visibility and bring more people's attention to Austen Mondays. Oh, and leave comments there as well. Thanks to Brianna, who was our chat Mrs. Reynolds, managing our links in the chat. And thanks especially to Emily Friedman for taking a turn about the room with us today. Next week, we'll be joined by Lord Norcliffe, Professor of Modern English Literature at the University College of London, John Mullen. John Mullen's going to be fun. He's a great guy to talk to about, I've talked to you about Dickens things, but Austen, it's great. I'm so excited to have him on the show next week. On next week's episode 8, Dr. Lauren Nixon will be here with me as a co-host to cover just one chapter. Chapter 18, the Netherfield Ball. Isn't that? Well, I'm sorry, Kathleen, you don't get the one.
I know, but I'll watch it. The Netherfield Ball. The Netherfield Ball.
That's what we're going to get next week. So thank you, Kathleen.
Thank you very much. It was lovely to see you.
Good. All righty. Thanks to Tucker Christine, who wrote our opening and closing credits music. Thanks to my daughter, Lulu, who shot and created the credits with me. Farewell, readers. I hope to dance with all of you at the next ball. Bye-bye.